Hi, and welcome back to the wood shop. On today's episode, we're going to do a little woodworking. We're going to go into the shop and try to build a push stick. And a push stick is a very simple project, but it's a very universal tool, one that we're going to use at all kinds of other tools. We're going to use it at the table saw, the band saw, and the jointer. Now, this push stick here is specifically designed for the table saw, but it works very well in other applications as well. And there's nothing too complicated about the push stick, but the one nice thing is it makes you use every single tool in the shop. So once you're done with this, you'll have a pretty good understanding of how most of the tools work in the shop. So with that being said, let's get started. As with most of the projects in the wood shop, our very first step is going to be to square up a board. So in this case, I've already squared it up, but if you recall, squaring up a board is where we make all of the surfaces perfectly flat, perfectly straight, and perfectly parallel with the opposite face or edge. So this face here has to be perfectly straight and parallel to this face here, which also has to be perfectly straight. We also need to make all of the ends be 90 degrees and 90 degrees. Okay, so that's squaring up the board. I'm not going to go through that today because I have another video on how to square up a board. But that's going to be your first step, is to get a board perfectly squared. When laying out your push stick, we want to take note of a couple of things. We want to look at the board and see if there's any knots. Knots are a very cool effect if we have them somewhere in the middle of the project. For instance, if that knot was right here, that would be really cool. It would be really cool if the knot was right here, and when the knot fell out, it left us that hole. So you can use knots to an artistic degree, but in this project, we want to make sure that the knots are not by the edge of the project. If they're by the edge, it can make the project structurally weak, and on something like a push stick, which is a safety device, that would be a very bad decision because it would compromise the safety of the project. So we're going to look for a spot that's clear of any knots, at least on the edge. And we're simply going to line this push stick up into the corner of our project board here. And we are going to make sure that the bottom of this push stick is exactly the same. So it's a 1/4 inch here and it's a 1/4 inch here, just to make sure that this space comes out perfectly even. And I've lined it all the way up into the corner because that will eliminate 2 cuts for us. So we will not have to do this cut and we will not have to do this cut, simply because the square board has already taken care of those. So once we've got it lined up, we're going to go ahead and trace this pattern out on our board. Be careful not to trace the pattern too small. It's easy to have your pencil go around the curves of this thing and make your drawing be smaller than what you intended it to be. So I'm going to go draw all the way around this thing. I'm going to draw the circle and just trace all of those out to where I come up with my push stick pattern. Okay, now if you don't have this pattern or you want to make your own, it's very easy to go match curves. So there's tons of circular objects around the shop. You could use this dust collection piece to get the curve, to fit it in here. So it's very easy to make curves using round objects around the shop. Here's a paint can, here's a bottle cap top. So you could find circles all over the place and just kind of get a curve that's nice for your hand, something that looks good and that you'd be happy using. I'll also have plans on the website of this exact shape if you want to copy this one exactly. But you don't have to copy it exactly. So we're going to trace one push stick on this side, and I'm going to trace one more push stick on the other side. Now, we left the board long when we squared it up just to make sure that it was a safe operation. But now that we've got everything squared and we're ready to start working on our pieces, it's a good time to just go ahead and separate these pieces. And you could do a simple cut on the bandsaw or miter saw. I'm going to go do a cut on the bandsaw. It's quick, easy, and safe, so we'll do it that way. And then we'll go ahead and start cutting out our project. Our push stick is now separated from the main board, and it's now time to start cutting out the different pieces of this push stick. Now, there's something called order of operations, and what that means is everything needs to be done in a proper order. If you go out of order, what will happen is sometimes you'll ruin the part that you're working on, or you'll get to a part and not be able to cut it. Or perhaps you could cut it, but it's going to take you a whole lot extra time. So we need to follow the order of operations. And in this project, we've got this straight line that runs along here. And what everyone wants to do is cut out this big curve first. It just looks like it, and you get rid of all of the project waste material. It just naturally seems like the right thing to do. But if you do that, you're going to end up throwing this thing in the garbage because you won't be able to cut it very easily or accurately. So what we want to do first is this long straight line on the bottom. Because if we were to cut all of this away, we would no longer have a reference. So when I use this fence here to guide this board in a perfectly straight line cutting it, when it goes against this fence here, if it was curved, the project would wobble and not get a straight cut as you went down this cut. So by keeping the order of operations in the right order, I can go ahead and do the long straight cut first and use the fence as my guide. I'll go ahead and make that cut now and show you. Since this cut on the bandsaw is going with the grain, this is going to be a rip cut on the bandsaw, and we're going to use the fence as our guide for this thing. The next cut that we're going to make is a cross cut, and it's this tiny little cut right here where my finger is. It's about a 1/4 inch long cut, and it's a cross cut going across the grain. In order to make that cut perfectly 90 degrees, you could use a miter gauge like so, and using that same reference that we used for the fence, we could use that to cut a 90-degree angle. But if you look, the way my table saw is, this miter gauge is on the wrong side. I would love to have it on the other side. So there's a couple of ways I could deal with this problem. I could put an extension fence on here, or in this case, I'm just going to flip it over and go ahead and cut it using the miter gauge. Since I know where the line is, it's very easy to match it up and make a nice cut. So I'll just go ahead and make this tiny little cut now, and then we'll move on. Remember, you're all going to want to pick that little piece up, but do not touch that piece until the blade comes to a complete stop. I know it looks like it's going to do something because it's vibrating around next to the blade, but do yourself a favor, get in the habit of leaving that thing there. It's not going to cause any problems unless you go down and grab it. Because anytime you grab a piece by a moving blade, it's very possible that the blade could grab that piece and pull your hand into the saw. So again, do not grab those little pieces on the edge of the bandsaw, those little cutoffs. Just leave them there until the saw stops, then you can clean. Next step in our order of operations is we're going to do this fun cut here that gets rid of all of the extra material. And I'm just going to make a rough cut going along just to remove the excess material. That will allow me to get into the interior curves a little bit easier. That rough cut was good practice for the precision cut you're going to have to make here at this next step. So for the next cut, we need to cut very precisely along the outer edge of this line right here. and we want to cut just outside of it, leaving the line in place. We're going to leave that line there so that in the next step we can go ahead and sand it to perfection. If you cut that line away, you're going to end up having to throw this project in the garbage. So make sure that you're very careful in leaving the line. You can always cut more off later. So if you're going to make an error on the side of leaving too much wood, because you could go back and cut more off at any time. It's not a big deal. So to make this precision cut, we first need to do something called relief cuts. And since bandsaw blades can only turn in so tight a radius, we're going to make a couple of relief cuts on this interior curve. Okay, now it's not that important how many you make. I'm going to make 4 just to make it a little easier, but you could probably get away with 2 or maybe even 1 depending on your skill level. I'm just going to put 4 in here just to show you kind of how it works. Those relief cuts are going to allow the blade to work into a very tight curve. Now, if you didn't do those relief cuts, this is what you would have the problem with. Let me raise this guide up out of the way. Now, you can see this bandsaw blade is flexible. It moves all over the place. And because of that flexibility, if you wedge it into too tight of a curve for it, you can end up breaking that bandsaw blade right off. So we do these relief cuts here, and that way when the blade comes in and cuts to this part, this little piece will fall away. And that relieves the stress on the blade so that it can straighten back out inside of that curve. So it's a very easy way to help get you to be able to cut tighter curves than what you would normally be able to cut on the bandsaw. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this, and you'll start to see these little pieces fall away. We're over here at the drill press for the next step. The next step, we're going to be drilling this hole right in the middle of the push stick. And this is not for putting your fingers or holding or anything. It's just for being able to hang it on the wall conveniently. So we're going to drill that hole out right now. Now I wanted to talk a little bit because we're going to be over at the drill press using this 1 3/4 inch Forstner bits. And Forstner bits need to turn at a very slow rate. They're also fairly big. So one of the things that I want you to always take note of is how big is this hole in the drill press table. Because every year drill press tables cry because some idiot leaves apprentice marks in them. And we don't want to see any apprentice marks in our drill press tables. If you see any kind of gouge out or drill peck marks on the drill press table, that's because some idiot didn't know what they were doing. Don't let that be you. We do not want to drill into the table. So we're going to use a backer board on our piece, and that's going to do 2 things. It's going to, 1, keep us from drilling into the table, and 2, it's going to help this board not blow out on the back side of it. So I'm going to get this thing set up here. The drill press is always dangerous because it can grab things and start spinning them around real quick. So I'm going to clamp this to the table, and then we'll go ahead and drill the hole out. In that last step, you watched me go around with the bandsaw and cut this intricate curve out. Now, the more skilled you are, the closer you can get without risking cutting into the project. Again, if you have any kind of trouble, there's no problem with cutting it 2 times or 3 times or 4 times or even 5 times. That's okay, as long as you don't cut too much off. Once you cut too much off, then the project's going in the garbage. Now, if you look closely around the edge here, you can see I took my time and I cut very close to the edge. I left about a 1/16 of an inch just past the line, and that way when I sand, I can go sand it to perfection. And so that takes a little bit of practice. You probably won't do it on your first time, and I don't know if you saw me, I was going pretty slow, just taking my time, making sure it came out right. It's well worth taking the time on this step because it's going to save you sanding time. And sanding is one of the most tedious, boring parts of woodworking, and it also generates a lot of dust. So the less sanding you have to do, the better off you are. So it's a good habit to get in the practice of doing great cuts so that your sanding time is greatly reduced. It's a good policy to follow if you want to become a good woodworker. I'm over at the disc sander now, and now we're going to clean this line up to perfection. We're going to get rid of all this rough edge here and smooth that out till it's perfectly smooth. The way I can tell that it's perfect is that I can't see or feel any defects on it. Now, the disc sander is very good at doing external curves, but it cannot do any internal curves. We'll have to use a different sander for that. So as of this step here, I'm focused on all of these external curves. So there's an external curve here, and then a big external curve here. And just as you learned on some of the instructions, we are not going to do the straight edges on this disc sander because it's almost impossible to get perfectly straight edges or 90 degrees using the disc sander. It's going to mess up more project than it fixes. So just keep the disc sander for external curves. And we'll go ahead and sand that right now. Since I did a good job cutting, this will go pretty quick. We're now ready to try sanding this interior curve here. And to do an interior curve, we're going to use the oscillating spindle sander to get that curve. When using the spindle sander, you want to pick a cylinder size that matches the curve. This is a pretty good match here. And this will only do interior curves. If you try to do an exterior curve with it, you'll get these weird scallop shapes that match the drum. So you never want to actually do an exterior curve with the spindle sander because you'll leave those little scallops in it. But on the interior curves, it does quite the extraordinary job. So we're going to go ahead and sand this interior curve up right now. Students often ask me, how do I know when I'm done sanding? And the simple answer is, sanding should get rid of every single tool mark. When you can't see or feel any imperfection on this, you've done enough sanding. Now you are going to be limited. We're over here at the drill press for the next step. The next step, we're going to be drilling this hole right in the middle of the push stick. And this is not for putting your fingers or holding or anything. It's just for being able to hang it on the wall conveniently. So we're going to drill that hole out right now. Now I wanted to talk a little bit because we're going to be over at the drill press using this 1 3/4 inch Forstner bits. And Forstner bits need to turn at a very slow rate. they're also fairly big. So one of the things that I want you to always take note of is how big is this hole in the drill press table. Because every year drill press tables cry because some idiot leaves apprentice marks in them. And we don't want to see any apprentice marks in our drill press tables. If you see any kind of gouge out or drill peck marks on the drill press table, that's because some idiot didn't know what they were doing. Don't let that be you. We do not want to drill into the table. So we're going to use a backer board on our piece, and that's going to do two things. It's going to, one, keep us from drilling into the table, and two, it's going to help this board not blow out on the back side of it. So I'm going to get this thing set up here. The drill press is always dangerous because it can grab things and start spinning them around real quick. So I'm going to clamp this to the table, and then we'll go ahead and drill the hole out. I've got the workpiece clamped down to the table now so that it can't spin, so it'll be safe for me to go ahead and drill this thing out. You especially want to be careful if you are drilling something like sheet metal that'll spin around like a little knife and start slicing you up. This one's not as bad because it's a thick piece of pine, which is a softer wood, and it's a smaller piece, so it's not as dangerous. But we always want to practice good practices that'll keep us safe. Don't get complacent, because that's when you're going to get hurt. Since this is a Forstner bit, we have to turn the drill bit at a very slow rate. We're going to use a pecking motion. We're going to go down, drill a little, come back up, and clear the chips. Now you're going to hear a slight change in the noise when it pierces through this top layer into the second one. So see if you can hear the difference. Should be getting pretty close now. I don't know if you could hear that tearing sound, but that's the sound of it going through the bottom of the workpiece. So that's a good way to get practice at knowing that, so you don't have to constantly pick it up and check. Here's the front side of the drill hole, and here's the back side. And you can see the back side has pretty much no tear out. It didn't explode out anywhere, and that's what having a backer board does for you. So it's a good idea to, when you're drilling, always practice having a backer board there to keep that wood from blowing out. That way you'll have a nice clean hole. Once all the sanding has been completed, we're going to do one of the more fun steps of the project, which is to do a cut on the router. Now this is a very complex cut, and I have a whole video on how to do this cut. So I'm not going to explain anything in this one, I'm just going to show you the cut. But if you haven't watched that video yet, make sure you watch that video before you try and do this route job. It's a very complicated route job, and you need to see the safety video before you attempt it. Always make sure the router comes to a complete stop before you pick anything up and set anything down next to it. Now our route job has been completed. Well, we're almost done with the push stick project. Just a couple more steps to go. In this step, we're going to do all of the sanding of the curved surfaces. Later, we're going to go do the faces, and we don't want any scratch marks from this sanding. So we got to do this sanding of the curves first so it doesn't mess up our faces. So we'll start with the sandpaper, and we're going to use 100 grit, 150 grit, and 220 grit. In woodshop, we usually only use those 3 grits. There are a few exceptions, but in general, most woods will basically, you can't see any scratches after 220. If you just keep going up in grits, 400, 600, 800, it doesn't tend to do a lot of good for you, because at 220, the human perception doesn't really see any scratches anymore. So we're going to stick with those 3 on this project. Again, 100, 150, 220. And always go in that order, roughest to finest. Now, since this is a push stick and we're going to be holding it in our hand, a perfect sanding contour is to use our hand to do the sanding. So we're just going to go through and do all these curves with our hand. And since we did such a good job so far, it shouldn't take long to sand this, probably just a minute or two. And I'll go ahead and do that off camera, and then I'll meet you back here. Well, I have to say, I lied to you in the last step. Actually ended up taking me about 12 minutes to sand that push stick. So, it may take you a little longer. I think I got used to cheating on the flap sander. So, we finally made it to the last step of the push stick project, and that is sanding the faces of the push stick. So, we just got 2 faces left to sand, and it's a very easy step. We got power sanders to do it. Again, we're going to go through the same 3 grits we did before, 100, 150, and 220. I'll go ahead and sand those real quick, and this is the last step, and we're done. And with that, we have completed the push stick. When you look through, you should be able to see nice, clean wood. Shouldn't be any scratch marks, any sanding. This should look like a magic spell out of Harry Potter's School of Wizardry created this thing. And that's what we've got. So once you're at this point where there's no scratch marks, no tool marks, and the piece just looks perfect, you've now got your push stick you can go start using on all the tools. So congratulate yourself on a job well done, and until next time, keep working in the shop.